I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm Teresa Mangum. I'm the director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. And one of the things that we have been doing for several years now is these Get It Done, the series. And I should have told you what the next one was, and I will look it up and put it in chat so that you'll know. But if you are not already on the Obermann Center mailing list, we do have all kinds of opportunities and and also public events, including informal events like this one. So I encourage you to go to the website and you'll see where you can sign up for the newsletter. So I am thrilled today that we have the wonderful Kristi Fitzpatrick with us. Kristi is the director of the grants office for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And she has been the person who has done wonders for people like me who are applying for grants and are imaginative in their budget approaches to budget rather than realistic. And so Kristi has kept me out of trouble for many years now. I cannot recommend highly enough seeking Kristi out if you're in class and you have questions. She will spend about 20 minutes or so, 20 or 30 minutes, giving us a kind of overview of the close reading process of grants. And then we'll switch to discussion. And if you have questions along the way, just tuck them into chat. And then when Kristi gets to the end of the presentation, I can help her get through the questions on chat. And we, as the group grows larger, the conversation will be a little bit more challenging, but we are absolutely delighted to try and answer questions for you. And for now, tuck them in chat, and then once we start the conversation, if we get too big to see everybody on one screen, you can use the raise hand function. Otherwise, I'm a great believer in gesture. Yeah. All right. So thank you and welcome, Kristi, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for all of the kind words. You're setting the expectations a little high, so hopefully I can live up to them. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everybody see that? Okay, good. Okay, so as Teresa said, I'm the director of the Grant Support Office for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I worked at the university supporting faculty and staff getting grants for, it's going on 16 years now, which is hard for me to believe, but I looked it up and it's 16 years. And so I've seen a lot of grant guidelines in my day, and I just wanted to share some of what I've learned over the years about how to do a close read of grant guidelines and what you want to be looking for. So just a general overview of what I plan to talk about. I'm going to give some general information and tips, and then we'll go over how to read guidelines to extract eligibility and feasibility of applying information, how to prepare a complete proposal, and then how to read the guidelines to get some information where you can actually strengthen your proposal. That's the good stuff. And then we'll have some discussion after that, as Teresa mentioned. But first, I'm going to have to give you all a warning. So there's a lot of acronyms, I think, in most fields, but the grant world is certainly no exception. As I was working on putting these slides together, I just started jotting down all the different names and acronyms that people use, sponsors use, and essentially these are all grant application instructions. So just be aware, I'm going to refer to them as guidelines throughout the presentation, but just be aware that they might go under any one of these names or maybe even something a little bit different. So there's all kinds of information that you can find in grant guidelines. And I know that it may seem intimidating when you see grant guidelines that are 100 pages or sometimes more, these big stacks. But in truth, I prefer those because the longer the guidelines are, the more information is going to be in there to help you craft a competitive proposal. If you get application instructions or a funding announcement that's like 2 or 3 pages long, you may not have much information in there to help you know what a successful proposal looks like for that organization. So try not to be too intimidated when you see these huge application instructions. Some of those federal sponsors can be a little bit unwieldy, but there's good information in there. So what do you find inside? Generally, you're going to find what the program's purpose is. This is where the sponsor's telling you what they want to accomplish with this program, and it's important for you to make sure that it's the right fit. It's going to tell you how to apply and what's needed for a complete application. It might provide some award information, and what I mean by that is they may tell you how much funding they have for this program in total and how many awards they plan to give out. There should be some budget information in there, what's allowed, what's not allowed, budget limits, that kind of information. And then with any luck, it's going to spell out the review criteria in detail. And there may also be some references to supplementary information that can help inform your project. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in future slides. So some general tips, you're going to want to read the entire document before you do anything else. The very first thing you do. That might seem obvious, but you'd be surprised. It's important because you might find information somewhere in the grant guidelines that disqualifies you from applying or disqualifies your institution from applying. Or you might get some information that leads you to believe that it's not the right fit after all. You maybe need to look for a different opportunity. Or maybe there's a requirement like a cost sharing commitment that you know you can't meet, or you don't have enough time to get through the appropriate channels at the institution. So you don't want to start working on a proposal and put some effort in to find out down the line that there's something that you can't actually do and then you can't submit the proposal. So just make sure you read through the entire thing before you get started. I will say that some grant guidelines include information that's really more relevant to post-award, like they'll reference grant auditing procedures, grant accounting requirements, that kind of thing. And although it makes me nervous to say it, I do think it's okay to kind of skim that information at the proposal stage. Most of the relevant budgetary information is going to be in a budget section, giving you instructions for how to put your budget together. The post-award stuff, if you're lucky enough to get the award, you're going to get documentation that outlines what your responsibilities are. And you should have a university staff person that's helping you manage it. So at the proposal stage, you maybe don't want to get bogged down in any of that kind of information. You also want to make sure that you have all the documents that you need. Sometimes there's more than one. NIH and NSF are examples of organizations where they'll have a funding announcement that's describing the program, and then they have a separate document that's application instructions that all applicants, regardless of what program they're applying for, are supposed to use. So you just want to make sure that you have everything you're supposed to have so that you have all the information you need. And then lastly, I'll say contact your grant person. If you're in the College of Liberal Arts, there is a staff person whose job it is to help you with this. We read guidelines, we're in and out of them all the time. We've seen a bunch of them, so we've gotten very familiar with some of the language and reading between the lines on things. So if there's anything in there that you have questions about, you can ask us, and generally we can answer them, or we know how to who to ask. So eligibility, this is usually pretty straightforward, but keep in mind there's all different kinds of criteria for eligibility, and this varies widely by sponsor. So I've given some examples here. This is not comprehensive, but many federal programs, for example, require US citizenship. Some private foundations require that you live in a certain area or that the project will benefit a community in a certain geographic area. That's fairly common for corporate foundations. You'll see a lot that they say that applicants must reside in areas where the company operates. And so you want to make sure you're aware of that. There's different requirements for faculty rank or what point you're at in tenure, or degree requirements. You may have to have a PhD or a terminal degree, or you may need to be pre-tenure, for example. There's programs that are designated for young investigators. Many of the federal sponsors have those, and they have requirements about how far out you are from your degree. And then there's also requirements about other funding that you have. So maybe you're not allowed to apply if you are already holding an award from that sponsor, or you can't hold them concurrently. That varies quite a bit, but you want to make sure you know, so that you're not submitting and preparing an application when you're not actually eligible. There's also some institutional requirements, so that's a good point. So a lot of grant guidelines will include eligibility requirements for whoever the project director is or principal investigator. But then there's also requirements for the institution. So examples of that might be only institutions with a 501c3 can apply. And just so you all know, we can apply through the Center for Advancement, who has a 501c3. So if you ever see that, you are eligible to apply. We just have to go through some different protocols. You see pretty often they'll say funding is only available to primarily undergraduate institutions, which we are not, or minority serving institutions is another example. So you want to make sure that our institution, the University of Iowa, qualifies. There's also limited submission to think about. Some programs limit how many proposals the university can move forward. So you want to make sure if you ever see anything in a grant guideline that says there's a limited number, you're going to want to look to the limited submission system for internal process, because there's going to be an entire internal review, and then the university will choose which proposals move forward. So that you want to make sure you know early so that you're not inadvertently missing an internal deadline of some kind. So there's, yes, okay, so I do have an example of some eligibility information for the NEH fellowship. And let me just apologize because I wanted to include hyperlinks so that we can actually go out to these documents and look at them. But the PowerPoint Adobe Zoom trifecta was a little bit more than I was able to sort out. So you just have screenshots. But in any case, this is the eligibility information from the NEH Fellowship Notice of Funding Opportunity. They require citizenship or foreign nationals who have been U.S. residents for 3 years prior to the grant deadline. You cannot be enrolled in a degree granting program during the period of the fellowship. I also think it's interesting that they've included cost sharing information in eligibilities. You can kind of see that in different places sometimes in guidelines. Often it will be with the budgetary information, but here there doesn't happen to be a cost sharing requirement, but if there was, you are only eligible if you can meet that requirement. In the other eligibility section, they have all kinds of information about what awards you've held previously from NEH and when you're eligible for the fellowship and when you're not. It's pretty specific. So you are not eligible if you've received certain awards from NEH previously, but some are okay. So if you've had a summer stipend, you can apply for a fellowship. You cannot serve as a project director on an NEH institutional award and apply for a fellowship. So this is something that's going to vary widely across sponsors, but you want to make sure that you understand it. Okay, so I think we'll talk, okay, feasibility. So assessing feasibility is a little bit trickier. This information is going to be scattered throughout the document. One of the most important things to consider is the deadline. This is where you really need to stop and think through what is going to be needed from you in order to meet this deadline. What are your other time commitments? You may find out that there are multiple stages, and you might have a deadline for the full proposal, but there's an earlier deadline that requires a letter of intent sent to the sponsor. And of course, there's the Division of Sponsored Programs 5-day deadline, and you really want to take advantage of their expertise if you can. So submitting with 5 days will allow for a comprehensive review of your application, and that's really valuable. So just thinking about what you're really able to do, and if it's a good time to go in for the grant, or if maybe you need to look for a different opportunity or pursue a future deadline. Institutional commitment and cost sharing kind of goes hand in hand. So cost sharing is usually pretty clear. When a sponsor requires it, they're generally going to say, the institution must provide a 50% match. So that's actually kind of greases the wheels a little bit at the institution, because when the sponsor states it explicitly, then usually that allows for that to move through the channels and get approved. When it's not required, that's a little bit trickier. And that's, you'll see sometimes in grant guidelines, they'll say institutional commitment is encouraged. Well, that means it's required, really. I mean, these programs are so competitive that if they're saying that it's encouraged, you have institutional commitment, then you need to be able to demonstrate institutional commitment in some way. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get commitment of a dollar amount, but you need to be able to communicate that the institution has some skin in the game. And another thing to think about with this is that sometimes proposals are going to require that you provide evidence of this, which would maybe need a letter of support from the president of the institution, or a provost, or a dean. There are grants that fund like certificate programs or curriculum programs, or if you're requesting support for a new faculty position, all of that has to be reviewed and approved by the provost. So if any of that needs to happen with your project, you're going to want to build that into your timeline when you're thinking about whether or not you can really get this done. And then you also want to consider your collaborators. Some programs require collaboration. You'll see must include interdisciplinary collaboration or multidisciplinary collaboration. If you're going to include a subaward where you're actually sending money to another institution, there's all kinds of paperwork involved in that. The other institution likely has their own internal deadlines that they need to meet before they can send you the information that you need to meet your deadline. So again, you're just backing the timeline up. You want to be respectful of your colleagues and of other institutions and your grant support staff, and so that you're not asking everyone to kind of drop everything and scramble to get this in. I mean, it does happen from time to time, we understand, but if it can be avoided, it should be avoided. So completeness, application guidelines will tell you what a complete application is. Sometimes they'll include helpful checklists, but other times not. And you may need to create one for yourself if you find that helpful. I know our staff in the grant support office for the college, they will create one for you if it's not included in the grant guidelines. Generally, grants ask for pretty similar documents. I don't really need to go through the whole list, but I will point out the other category. So in addition to these more basic documents that are fairly common across grants, there's a whole wide variety of ancillary materials that may be asked of you. So letters of support and collaboration, for example, sometimes they're required, sometimes they're not allowed. Sometimes they're allowed and the grant guidelines specify what they have to include, or they'll actually give you a template that you are required to use. A signature page is another good example. So there's our sponsors that require a signature that's submitted with the application that has to go through the Division of Sponsored Programs. Marty Schultz is the authorized representative for our institution, and he or one of his delegates are the only ones that are allowed to sign off on any of these documents. So don't ever sign anything. That's the moral of that story. And then depending on what your proposed activities are, you may be asked to submit additional documents. Like if you have human subjects, they might want to know what your protocols are. If you're requesting a postdoc, they may ask you to include a mentoring plan. If you have multiple investigators on a project, they might ask you for a leadership plan or management plan. Anyway, the list goes on. So you just want to be aware of everything that's going to make a complete application, and make sure that you're looking into what's going to be needed to get those in hand so that you have them on time. And I actually have an example here of a checklist that I think is pretty helpful. So this is from the NEH Media Projects grants. And what I like about this is that they've got in the left-hand column here all the components that are needed for a complete application, and then they're hyperlinked to the area in the grant guidelines where you're going to find what the purpose of that document is and what information needs to be in there. So that actually makes that a little bit easier to navigate. You'll see there in the middle column that they actually have naming conventions for their documents. So that's going to come up later. I'm talking about compliance. So in any case, not every grant guideline is going to include something that's this useful, but some of them do. So compliance. On this slide, I've just given some examples of common formatting requirements. Font size and type is often specified. Some grants require page numbers, others ask that you not include them. And for attachments, they might require certain types. Most commonly, it's a PDF, but they might say no fillable PDFs, or you can't have certain characters in there or something like that. Excuse me. So for project, naming conventions. So yes, often there's naming conventions for the attachments, like we saw on the previous slide. And then project title. This one I think is really easy to miss. Sometimes they have character limits for your project title, or sometimes they require that it starts with a certain word or phrase. NSF is a good example of that. If you're doing collaborative research, the title has to start with collaborative research : and then you put your title. So you want to make sure that you're aware of those types of requirements. And then in the budget section, there's going to be information about what goes in the budget. Often there's rules about the indirect cost rate, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And some of them have kind of unusual ones, like I gave an example, limits on salary. So they may say, oh, you may request funds for salary, but it must be limited to 30% of the total budget. Or, another good example might be that you can request a graduate research assistant, but the sponsor won't pay for tuition. Tuition is a requirement when you have a graduate student, so that's going to be a cost that the institution is going to have to bear. And you want to make sure you know that in advance. So I have found that when you're addressing those things at the proposal stage, it goes much more smoothly than if you're doing it at the award stage and it's a surprise to everybody that now all of a sudden the university's on the hook for something and we hadn't planned for it. So you just want to make sure you're aware of that. And then there's also sometimes requirements for certain groups to participate. We see, must require undergraduate students or must require graduate students, or there must be some community engagement or community involved in developing the project. So that would be considered a compliance, not a strengthening your proposal kinds of things. These are things that you have to do. They're not optional. Some application systems will not validate your proposal if any of this is validated, or if any of this is not validated. Some will be validated, but then the program officers will decide not to move them forward to the review committee if they find anything that's not compliant. I mean, they get hundreds and hundreds of proposals, and sometimes they're looking for ways to weed proposals out, and compliance is one of the areas where that happens. At a minimum, if you're not compliant, you're going to annoy the reviewers if you make it to the review panel. So it's really important that you follow what they're asking you to do. And I can give you an example from NIH. It has a lot of requirements, which is why I chose them as the example. They actually have a web page dedicated to what their formatting requirements are for attachments that I have here. And you can see this long list. And then when you click on each of these, it has more information about what's required for each of those things. So I think I have what's required for font on the next slide. Yes. So these are the requirements for font from NIH and line spacing. So it's really common to see font size and type requirements, but NIH also has type density, which is no more than 15 characters per linear inch. And then line spacing requirements, they must be no more than 6 lines per vertical inch. I have actually gotten out a ruler and measured documents before. And we have creative PIs trying to circumvent page limits to thank for some of these requirements, because what happens is people have gotten very creative and they mess with their margins or font size or spacing or whatever, and it makes it difficult to read. So they really do want you to follow these. So now this is the good stuff. This is the stuff that you can pull out from the grant guidelines to help you strengthen your proposal. So review criteria. At first glance, it might seem like funders all have very different review criteria, but in truth, there's more consistency than you might think, particularly for federal sponsors. So a group of, I guess I'll call them grant enthusiasts, published an article on this exact thing. And they did scientific research on this. And they published an article, which this is actually hyperlinked. So Teresa, we can make the slides available to everyone after, if anyone's interested in digging more deeply into some of these links.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so you'll have all these links if you're interested in reading more about this. So the thing to know is that although there are similar criteria, they're called different things by sponsors. So just to give a few examples, why does the project matter? NIH calls this significance. NSF calls it intellectual merit and broader impacts. And NEH calls it humanities significance. But in the end, they all just want to know why your project matters and why they should fund it. How is it new or unique? NIH calls that innovation. NSF calls it original transformative concepts, and NEH calls it quality of innovation. But essentially, it's the same review criteria. How will it be done? NIH calls that approach, NSF calls it plan for carrying out activities, and NEH calls it project feasibility and work plan. But again, it's how are you going to get the work done? So I won't go through the rest, but the point is that these 6 questions represent a lot of the review criteria across sponsors. And I should say that this is primarily for research grants. Programmatic grants often have some additional requirements that you'll see. maybe a dissemination plan, for example, or outreach, or quality of your assessment plan, your assessment and evaluation plan. And I think I have an example of one from a programmatic grant on the next slide. Yes, okay, so this is from the Department of Education Undergraduate International Studies and Foreign Language Program. This project funds curriculum development and other programmatic activities that supports undergraduate instruction in the areas of international study and foreign language. So they lay out the review criteria, and they tell you how many points are for each one of these review criteria. So I can tell you, I've reviewed for the Department of Education several times. And we've done it as a group, so I've witnessed what other reviewers have done. And I can tell you that most of us sit down with the grant, and the technical review form is usually what it's called, but it's basically this list with the points, and then it breaks down what they're looking for under each one of these things. And we go back and forth between the technical review form and the grant to try and assess each of these criteria. So if you see this in the grant guidelines, if I was going to apply for this grant, this list right here would be the outline of my narrative. And I would use the same words. So I might have an introduction of some kind, but then my next heading would be plan of operation. And then I would describe the plan of operation. Quality of key personnel. I would write something for quality of key personnel, and then probably refer to the bio sketches or CVs or anything. So if you're lucky enough to get something like this, use it to help you frame up your grant, because it makes it very easy for reviewers, and they like that. So a little about language. So knowing your audience is important for all communication, and your grant proposal is really a communication tool for how to tell the sponsor how you are going to further their mission. So your audience in this case is the sponsor and whoever's reviewing for them. So you want to use language that's consistent with what they have in their guidelines. I also recommend that you look at their website, their mission statement. You don't have to limit yourself just to the grant guideline document. And try to avoid using only your internal terminology or too much professional jargon. You won't always have experts in your area reading the proposal. And even if they are from your field, they may not have deep knowledge of your specific topic. So it needs to be accessible. It is a bit of a balancing act. You don't want to repeat portions of the guidelines exactly. But you want to take your project and the points that you want to make, and then use the sponsor's language to tell them why they should choose you to be funded. So I have an example on the next slide. This is from the application guidelines for the Creative Capital Awards program. It's a private foundation. And they're laying out here what they tell reviewers to look for. So the project idea, capacity, timing, readiness, and generosity. These criteria should help shape your narrative. And I've highlighted a few phrases in this particular document that might make sense for you to pull out and use in your narrative. So for example, in the project idea, it says, what is the artistic strength, vision, and originality of the proposed project? This includes demonstrating boundary pushing, bold, and singular ideas. So in your narrative, you can say, this project pushes the boundaries of, and then tell them how you're pushing the boundaries. Under timing, it says that they want to enter the life of a project at a key moment. So in your narrative, you can say, we are at a key moment in, and then describe what the key moment is and how the sponsor funds are going to impact how you move forward in a way that meets the sponsor's mission. Just one more example, under generosity, they say they value artists who are generous towards their peers and professional colleagues. So you may want to explain how you've benefited from the generosity of your own colleagues and how you plan to pay that forward. And as I said before, it is a balancing act. I mean, you don't want to just repeat everything they have in their grant guidelines. The substance of what you're proposing should be all yours, but reflecting the sponsor's language back to them, you're communicating that you understand their mission and their goals, and you're helping reviewers recognize where they can find information to help them assess the grant. So, okay, so we're getting close to the end. Supplementary information. So this, sometimes, not always, grant guidelines include links to various other information. That information is really helpful, and I can tell you, not a lot of people actually take the time to link out and read those documents. So they might refer to an annual report or a strategic plan, a previous list of awards, FAQs, a recorded webinar, so on. If any of those links are in the grant guidelines, I highly recommend that you go look at them. Annual reports in particular are one that I personally really like, because I think annual reports generally, they're almost always available on the website, the sponsor's website. And this is where they highlight what they're proud of. So if you look at the annual report, you can recognize what a successful project looks like to them, like what outcomes they're looking for, because they're highlighting them in their annual report. And then you can use that information to frame up what you're proposing to do. So since I couldn't link to the actual document, I pulled out some of the supplementary information that was referenced in the National Endowment for the Arts Research Grants grant guidelines. The list includes all the links that they provided. And so if you were applying for this program, I would recommend that you go out and look at all of these. FAQs are always really helpful. Chances are, if you have questions after you've read the guidelines, someone else did too, and they may have already asked and answered your question. The 5-year agendas, their strategic plan, and it will tell you what the National Endowment of the Arts wanted to accomplish in this time period. And then you need to make sure that you're telling them in your proposal how you're going to help them do that. There's various other ones here. I will just say about the list of recent awards that can also be very helpful. That can show you what they've been funding recently, like what kind of awards they're giving out, what kinds of institutions they've been funding. So for example, if you see that every organization in the past 2 years was a small community nonprofit, even if the University of Iowa is eligible to apply, maybe we wouldn't be a very strong candidate. And that's something you want to know before you go through the trouble of applying for the award. So now that you have all this information, you should be able to read the instructions carefully. So that is the end of my prepared comments. I'll just say that there are staff to help you with this. The grant support office on the website here that you can link to has the roster of all the grant support people and what departments they work with. I'll also mention the Division of Sponsored Programs because they have very knowledgeable staff. And then for graduate students, the office of the Graduate Student Success Center is an excellent place to go, where they have very talented people that have read a lot of grant guidelines too and can help you interpret. So with that, I'll stop talking.
Thank you so much, Kristi. That's really, really helpful. Just a couple of things, and please feel free to, as I say, use the hand raise function, or just say in chat, ask your question in chat, or say that you'd like to speak into the group on chat, and I'll call on you. But Mary Blackwood is also here, who's another campus wonder when it comes to grants in the Division of Sponsored Programs. And as she tucked in your in the chat for you, with the link that you need. There's a wonderful office where if you have an idea for a grant, oh, there's Mary right there. If you have an idea for a grant that you want to apply for, you can send key terms and a basic description to that office, and they have access to this, phenomenal set of a searching tool. And so all kinds of applications turn up that you just wouldn't normally encounter. And one of the things that Kristi and I talked about when we were planning this session is the fact that, especially for those people outside the sciences, but probably even scientists, there are all sorts of federal awards, and they tend to be, those funding agencies tend to be very, very strict and clear and specific about what they want. But one of the places a lot of us have turned for funding is foundations. And foundations can be quite a different kettle of fish. And the good news is they can be a lot more tailored in their interest, so that you might be one of fewer people applying for money to a foundation because they are only going to fund a limited set of things. And Kristi or Mary, I wonder if you all would say a little bit about how people find foundation awards and how that might be a different process, or is it a different process?
Well, I'll just speak up and say that the person we have in DSP who helps to search for grants and has a master's in library science and information is Oliva Smith. And she's just able to find so many different small foundations. There are so many that it's really hard for any one person to know where they all are. I mean, they're all trying to get attention. But some of them are just having trouble because they're all the biggies, Mellon and Ford Foundation and so many others that get so much of the attention. But there might be a small family foundation that could even be really new. Maybe somebody in the family had a certain love of art or music, and they, gave a bequest to fund something very specific. Those can be hard to find, but if you can get some help from Oliva to do that, or search for them yourself and then get on their mailing lists, that's a great way to learn about when they might have an opportunity you'd be interested in.
And I'll just say too that the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Grant Support Office staff will all assist with funding searches. And we generally work with Oliva Smith, who Mary just mentioned, to try and capture as many opportunities as we can. And usually we do that by, having a conversation by email, or when we were on campus, maybe having a meeting in person, to learn more about what it is that you want to do and kind of how much money you actually might need, because the scale of these vary widely. And then we can do some searching for you and send you some opportunities. And often what happens is that we cast a very wide net because we don't always know like the nuances of what you want to do. So we might send you a list of 10, and then you'll look at them and say, okay, these 5 don't work at all. This one looks awesome, and the other ones I'm not sure about. And then that helps us kind of more laser focus into what it is that you need. And then we might go out and search again and find even more once we have a better understanding. But particularly for the private foundations, there is not a magic bullet to find that. It's time consuming, and it's looking at a bunch of different sources. So I just recommend that you use the staff resources available to you.
And one other thing that I would add, I noticed that there are a number of graduate students on the call, as well as faculty and staff. And one of the things that I think a lot of grad students don't realize is that there are all these tiers of grants. So for example, in my field, in literary studies, there are a lot of special collections libraries. There's one at Indiana that's just a stunning Lilly Library, the Ransom at University of Texas. And they offer their own grants to come work for 3 weeks on one of their collections, to come work for a summer, even days, just for a few days. If you build a kind of stack of several of these grants that are shorter time, that are far less competitive than the big national grants. Then when you get ready to apply for one of the larger, like the National Endowment for Humanities or NSF grants, you have a track record of you've applied for a grant, you know how to do it, and you can deliver whatever you said you were going to do. You have evidence to show you produced that article or whatever it was you had proposed for your application. And so that's another thing for junior people and grad students especially, that Oliva can help you locate what are the specific smaller funds dedicated to your project that would position you then later for one of these bigger grants. Now, at the same time, and I would love to hear what you think about this, Kristi and Mary, I was talking to somebody the other day about applying for funding, and that person's mentor had been pushing them so hard, apply for grants. And the person was sort of desperate. And my impulse was to say, what do you need money for? Because just applying for grants is actually exhausting and really labor intensive. I mean, Kristi and Mary, how do you help people decide whether a grant is really what they need?
Kristi?
Oh, you want me to go? Yeah, so we rarely discourage people from applying. Applying for a grant can be a really valuable exercise, even if you don't get funded. But Teresa, your point is really good, that you don't want to put in all the effort to put a proposal together if you don't really need the funding. And I do think that there is kind of increased pressure as there's budgetary, considerations at the university where that's kind of everyone's drumbeat right now. Look for grants, get external funds. But you're right, it's not always appropriate or realistic for everyone.
Mm-hmm. I would agree that I think it's really a great exercise to even do. And if you can get a grant, it's great to have it on your resume. But also it does take a lot of time. And the fact is that it's something you kind of have to practice at sometimes before you really get good at it. And you have to understand also that you're probably not going to get it the first time around or the second or third, but as you get better at it and get a better sense of what a sponsor's looking for so that you can target your next proposal better, I mean, it'll be a really wonderful thing when you finally get a grant, and maybe not finally, some people get them quickly, but it's a great feeling and a great boost to one's career, I think. But on the other hand, Teresa's absolutely right. That's a great question. What do you need the money for? Do you need it? But if you do for a project, you're going to get a grant on your CV, and you're also going to get that project on your CV.
And part of what I think to be more specific, I see is people trying to twist their project into a project that matches the mission, rather than saying that's not the right match for me. I need to find a different funder. I need to be clear about what it is I need money for one thing, because as I think Kristi's point, made so clearly, her presentation made so clearly, that mission and the motivation for providing funding and your project have to just be the ideal match for you to be really competitive. Mary, you also said something I think is such valuable information, and that is, especially for people like me who are in the humanities and aren't really accustomed to applying for a lot of grants or weren't in the past, I see a lot of people who apply one time, aren't successful, and give up. And this is a place where I think we've got a lot to learn from our colleagues in the sciences. I wonder, just on average, how many applications does it take somebody to strike gold, would you say?
Obviously, it's all over the map, but you look at some NEH opportunities, and they'll literally say we fund 7%. Okay. The same thing happens in the sciences, but those people have to get the grant to run their lab, so they know they have to keep trying and keep trying. It can be very discouraging, but I would say that it could take 3 to 10 grant applications to get your first one. I would also say that a lot of sponsors have said if they allow resubmission and they give you the reviewer comments, even though you don't make it the first time, they can do that. I think we've lost somebody.
Yeah. I mean, resubmission, it's like with publication. It's just, yeah. So
the chances can go way up. Yeah, if you resubmit something after you paid real attention to the reviewer comments. Yeah.
Are there other people who have questions? Yeah, Suraj.
Hi, thanks for the workshop. It was really very helpful. So I had a couple of questions. So I'm a graduate student here at the University of Iowa in the Department of Philosophy, and I come from India. So one question was with regard to the US itself, and the other thing has to do with trying to have a good profile for a grant proposal. So the first thing is like, so in India, when it comes to good academic standing, right? So we have like a very different system. Instead of the GPA, we have a first division, a second division, like you have in the UK, right? And so ideally speaking, for someone in the liberal arts, if you have a first division, right? So that's like in the top 1%, top 2%. And so like, that's what is required. The higher you go, the better it is. But if you have a 60%, you don't have to care about your marks anymore. You're in good standing. Wherever you apply, you have a good chance. It depends on the rest of the profile. I'm not too sure about what that would translate to in the US. So like in my imagination, it's more about, as long as you're getting all A's, it's great. And if you're not, then that's kind of problematic. And you need to start really worrying about the fact that you may not be getting any grants in the future because not all are A's. So like if in terms of the GPA, if you could tell me a sort of a rough ballpark, like if you have this amount of a GPA, you can stop worrying about your like the actual grad school score, and just try to make sure that you have publications and other such stuff, and then you have a really good chance at securing a grant. And the second question I had was that as a graduate student, especially in the liberal arts, some of you might be aware, the kind of research work that we do, it's mostly has to do with the papers or our own research interests, and we are trying to develop a proposal for our own dissertation and stuff like that, right? So if I want to show to a funding corporation or a funding agency that I have good research potential. So apart from letter of recommendations from the professors, and assuming that I haven't received a grant yet, what are the various ways in which I can sort of establish that I am a good or a promising research scholar, and that it's worthy enough for the agency to sort of have faith in my abilities and give me that opportunity to get started with research work through their grants. So those are my two questions. Thanks.
Those are good questions. They're kind of hard to answer, actually. So Mary, I'm going to ask you to chime in too. So going back to your first question about grade point average, I would say in general, most grants don't ask for that kind of information. Some fellowships may ask you to submit transcripts or something, which is going to, show what your grades are, and that would be how you would communicate it. But I'm not thinking on the grants that I've worked on, they have not asked for grade point averages or transcripts or anything like that. I think that would be contained to fellowships. Mary, would you agree with that?
Right. I would say one thing I work with a lot, it's in the biomedicine, the American Heart Association, for their pre-doc awards, they do request transcripts. And I've seen a number of them from people from other countries who are studying in the US, and that they need to put in an explanation of, how that country's system of grading equates to the US one. But I would also say that I've seen a lot of people, they don't necessarily have all straight A's, and they will still get a grant. It's oftentimes also the quality of the idea.
Yeah.
And it's also, it goes to your second point, Suraj, about asking about how do you convince them that you are an up and coming person who can do this? That is a hard thing about a grant, but it's an important thing to convince the sponsor that you're going to be able to take on what you say you are and get it done. Because very few funders would ask for money back if you don't finish the project. Some people just, you know, they won't give you the rest of the money if you stop working on it. But the fact is it's going to look really bad. So what you have to do is somehow convince them that you're one of the people who will get it done, because then they'll have something to brag about, you know, just say, look what we funded. So I think in writing it, what you need to do is, it really helps to have letters of reference if that's part of it. Somebody you can say, yes, he gets things done. Another way might be if you've received any even small awards, maybe from your college, that you've had art or shows of art that you've done or something, you know, talks you might have been involved in, that if you can throw that kind of stuff in to show that people are looking to you because they understand you're somebody who gets things done. And you also want in your writing to kind of balance, you know, you need to talk about abstract things, but also very particular details, because if you can give details about something, that tends to convince people that you know what you're talking about, because you can speak not in just an abstract way, but in a very specific way. And they know that you know the topic. And that might be a good way. That's just some thoughts off the top of my head. It's a great question. And I don't have a perfect answer.
Yeah, there isn't a perfect answer to that. But I would also add that if you can communicate that any parts of your projects are already in place. So for example, if you're proposing to work with a certain archive, let's say, in your narrative, tell them what archive, tell them specifically which documents you're planning to access there. It shows that you've already kind of laid the groundwork, and it speaks to the feasibility of you being able to complete the project. So I think if you lack experience or having previous research grants, then you kind of need to make up for that in your work plan to communicate very clearly that you know what you need to do and that you've kind of already started the ball rolling in that direction.
That's a great point. And another thing you could even do with like an archive is say, and let me add that I have reached out to the archive and they've already said they'd be happy to host me.
Yes.
That shows you've got the initiative, that you went out and did that, you laid that groundwork, like Kristi said, and also that, you know, you've already got some people who are buying into your project.
We're about at the end of our time, but I wanted to add one other piece of advice. I just finished reviewing grants for 2 different agencies that range from graduate dissertation fellowship applications to senior fellowships. And one of the things I was so struck by, even with the senior colleagues, but especially with more junior people, is the forest and the trees problem. So that very, very often the person writing the grant application was so close to the process that person was intent on saying, I'm doing this and I'm doing this and this. And then I would read and I would think, well, that's kind of interesting. And then I would read the letters of recommendation and I'd be blown away, because they told me why the project was significant. And they told me what larger conversation it was part of and what was exciting about this particular strand of work, or who it was going to be important to. And that is one of the reasons I think it's so important to draft just very, fast and furiously your narrative account of your project, to do that early and be able to show it to other people, because often others who've worked with you, or even friends you've told your work, described your work to, they often see in a way it's hard for you to, the big implications of your project, what's really exciting to a non-super specialist about your project. And it's just transformative when people like that help you identify, here's the part of the project that's going to get a lot of people excited. And the more granular detail might not be so necessary. So that would be, I just kept being so dazzled by letters of recommendation and thinking, oh, I wish you had told this person how good that work was. We're at our time. It's great to see such a wonderful group, and Kristi is willing to do additional workshops later this semester. So focusing in on parts of the grant. So she and I might talk about that, having seen how many people showed up. And if you have ideas for grant related topics you would like to know more about, feel free to email me, Teresa Mangum. I'm on the Obermann website. But in the meantime, I say take your mute off. And let's give Kristi a big round of applause to thank her for the presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.